presentation was technically stolen from Google, but given to me by some people at Utah Triangle, which is the STEM fraternity on campus. And they have a lot of other great professional resources. But they were the ones who organized a lot of the content that I'm showing you. So just a shout out to them. Okay, so time to do some resume tips. Let's start with some general tips. I found that a lot of professors in their classes will try to give resume tips, and every student just walks away with like, yeah, a better resume. But I don't think it's a very good resume. And I just think like professors haven't been in the application game in such a long time that they haven't really had to worry about it. And a lot of trends in resumes have changed significantly over the past few years. So I think it's important to just sort of update that and stay up to date on current trends. So general rules for resumes. You want it in a PDF format and it should be one page. You don't ever want to have 2 pages. There's kind of some general rules that people give out. We'll say like, oh, if you have 10 years of experience, then you can go to 2 pages. But for the most part, and especially in your case, there's no reason why you should be going over 1 page. You want to make it clean, simple, consistent, bullet pointed. The idea is that a recruiter who's looking at your resume can figure out exactly what they need about you as easily as possible. The other thing you want to include are things like action words or metrics, results and impacts of the work that you've done. Make sure you include contact information. So if a recruiter just stumbles on your resume but has no way to contact you, I mean, that's a problem. So you want to make sure that there's sufficient contact information that they can contact you if necessary. And then the last thing is this idea of putting a references upon request section. Some people will sort of counter-signal this or say that it's not necessary, but I think it's kind of a bold move to say like, yeah, I'm confident enough that if you want references for my work here, I can give them to you. And it kind of it stands to improve your credibility on your resume. So let's talk about the general resume structure next. So the first part should always be education. After that, we like to list work experiences, projects you've done, activities, leadership, honors, and awards. These are also in order of kind of the priority, but I do want to stress before we sort of go into the deep dive that you shouldn't just build a single resume. So I had to admit someone who's joining late. I forgot to turn that off. I just want to stress that you shouldn't just build one resume and then call it good. Really, you should adapt your resume to the application, the job, and the situation you're applying for. I'll go over some of the ways you can adjust your resume once we go through this deep dive. But you just don't want to have it in mind that your resume shouldn't be static. It should be somewhat dynamic, and you should have the ability to change it on a whim and still have it be effective. Okay, so let's get into the deep dive and talk about specific language and formatting. We'll start with the education section. So it's the first section on your resume, and generally you want to put post-secondary schools attended. So nobody really cares about the high school you attended unless you went to like a super prestigious one that has a lot of recognition, but typically most employers aren't going to be interested in the high school you attended. It's mostly at the university. So that's really where you want to put it. The next is your intended major, minor, degree. Let them know what you're even studying and make it easy for them to find. The next is the graduation month and year. A lot of times recruiters look at your resume, and if they see that you are going to be graduating in the spring, right? If they offer you an internship, it's an opportunity for you to then be hired on. It also tells them a little bit about what year you are in your program. And so they have an idea of how much experience you might have gained. The next thing is grade point average. So the one thing about GPA is that if you have a very good GPA, like 3.5 or above, you should put it on there. If you don't have a very good GPA, I wouldn't put it on there, right? Like recruiters are looking for any excuse possible to stop paying attention. And if at the very top in the education section, they see kind of a lower GPA, it's an excuse for them to stop paying attention. Now, I don't believe a GPA really says all that much about a person. You can have people with low GPAs who are brilliant or very hardworking. So if your GPA is not the best, I would just not include it. Unless they ask for it, you can tell them. Let other things speak to you, to your abilities and skills. Next is relevant coursework and technical skills. Relevant coursework kind of tells them what classes you've taken, what experience you've had. Technical skills might help them with what what you can do. Like, oh, do you know Python? Do you know MATLAB? Do you know how to do AutoCAD design? And a lot of the reason you put this in there is that if you're applying to a very competitive application process, a lot of companies these days have like automatic filtering tools. So they look for keywords in your resume, and if you don't have X% match to the job description, they just throw out your resume right there. They won't even consider it. So it's important to try to have these keywords on your resume. And a lot of times coursework and technical skills are those keywords they're looking for. That way you make it past that first filter. You don't want to get caught there. And I'll show you a tool at the end here for how you can check your resume against that. Okay, and if you have any questions along the way, just unmute yourself and just go ahead and ask me. Be brave. There's no dumb questions here. Resumes are tricky and it's more of an art than a science. Okay, so let's look at an example of how you do in education. So we have our University of Utah, Bachelor of Science Chemical Engineering, minor Computer Science, graduation date and month, and their major GPA. Relevant coursework, fluid mechanics data, technical skills. So this is kind of a good example of how you'd want to structure the education section of your resume. Let's move on next to work experience. This is kind of the big one, and this is where a lot of people have some trouble. So I think wording is really important, but the big thing is to focus on your impact. You want to include, anytime you list work experience, the employer, position, dates employed, and you want to keep your bullet points very clear, concise, and descriptive. You don't want someone like a recruiter having to read several paragraphs in order to get the gist of what you actually did there. Like I said, they're looking for excuses to stop paying attention. So don't give them any. The other thing is consider relevant experiences. This is what I was kind of talking about, where you don't want to have just a static resume. If you're applying for a job that's coding heavy and you have some experience in industry that's non-coding related, and then some experience maybe in a research project or in industry as well that's more coding related, you should prioritize the coding related one, right? That's going to be much more relevant. However, I also understand that when you're in your first couple of years, you might not have enough experience to make it interchangeable. So, but this is just something to keep in mind as you do gain it. So next is the general formula for these bullet points. This can vary a little bit, but in general, when you're writing these bullet points, you want to frame it this way. You accomplished X as measured by Y by doing Z. This is super important and it will absolutely transform the way that your resume looks and how it's worded and how it sounds to a recruiter. So let's look at an example of how you'd apply this. So here's a before one. So this person interned at Space Y, not to be confused with SpaceX, and they're a project engineering intern. Okay, so this part looks fine, but they obtained project engineer experience in the aeronautics industry, performed computer analytics for propulsion testing, and languages Python. So this doesn't really say a lot about what they actually did there. It's very general and abstract and doesn't speak well. So let's say we are using this formula back here, and let's see how we can make this better. So here's applying that, right? Developed an analytics program in Python to cut launch data compilation in half. Designed prototype propulsion mechanism using AutoCAD. Presented final project. Results at local research expo, taking third place out of a pool of 25 other projects. It sounds a lot better. This paints this person as very accomplished. It shows how they're able to use tools to accomplish different tasks. And it also quantifies things. Numbers are some of the easiest ways to communicate data quickly because you can just cut something by half and you automatically know what it means. There's nothing, you don't need too much more explanation. So when you're writing these, it's important to try to quantify or use numbers as much as possible, provided that they're meaningful, right? If you compete in something and you win, you should say how many other competitors there were, right? If you compete against one other person and win, it's like, okay, not a big deal. But if it's against a lot more people, it really puts it in context and emphasizes that. The other thing you want to do is, a lot of recruiters, especially at a recruitment fair, will just be skimming your resume. So it's helpful to essentially emphasize things like Python or AutoCAD or SEM, other tools that you've used that are very important to the job that you're applying for or your field in general. That way they stick out to the employer and their attention will be drawn to them. Okay, so that's generally how you want to structure your work experience. This can vary too, depending on what it is, but the big thing is just make sure it's relevant and impactful. So next we'll move on to projects. So same sort of thing, but these tend to be a little bit different because they're often personally driven, more so than you go to a company and they issue some sort of tasks that you complete. So the thing is, you want to, again, focus on your impact. We use the same formula here. And projects can be anything from course projects to personal projects. So a lot of courses ask you to make something at the end of them. It's in place of the final, or there's some sort of design project involved. And if you don't have a lot of personal projects, that's a good way to flesh this out. And a lot of the reason you want to show these is because it can show the employer that you can do lots of different things. You're self-motivated. It also shows it can help show your thinking process, as well as be another avenue for learning, right? Like, you don't need to only learn about things through class, but it can be hard to validate and give credibility to learning if it's like, oh yeah, I watched a bunch of YouTube videos, or I did this project and it required me to learn this tool, this coding language, learn more about ceramics, something like that. It can lend credibility there. So here's an example. I think both of them are just coding, but keep it simple and easy, right? This is one for a class. So same formula, used some language to provide webmail storage. Okay, we don't need to read it, but the same formula is applying here. And this way it takes up very little space on your resume, but it really fleshes out the experiences you have and can make you a more well-rounded candidate. So the next section is activities and leadership. So this is an area where you can start to get a little more personal, where you can tell them what excites you and about the different interests you have. So, people don't want to just see you being some sort of robotic person who just does internships and solves equations, right? Like, you're still a person who has to integrate within their company. And so this is a great way to present yourself in a more well-rounded fashion and add some personality to yourself present in the form of your resume. So this can be things like clubs or organizations, national society chapters, any sort of competitions or things that you've engaged in. I know one guy, on his resume, he has on there that he won like a pie baking contest at a state fair. And although it doesn't really say much to his ability to do engineering, it becomes a conversation starter and it makes him a unique candidate. So really you can think out of the box and be pretty creative here. This is also a place for teaching assistantships, research opportunities, STEM-focused developmental projects, open source projects. So really you can be pretty creative here as well. And the activities and leadership section is different from the project section in one that it's a little more diverse and abstract, and it's a little less detailed as well, typically. So here's an example. So you may be involved in some club, right? And if you are involved in the club, it's nice to say that you're in there, but it's also nice to say how you actually were involved in the club and what you did and what experience you gained from it. Same with if you're a teaching assistant. And here you go. Here's some great ways you can think about quantifying what you did. So even if it's hard to figure out like a way to quantify something, like not everyone can say like, oh, I did calculations that cut costs in half, right? But you can also say like, yeah, I led sort of educational programs and office hours for X number of students. And that allows that really puts context and magnitude into what you've done. Okay, last section, honors and awards. So this can be distinguished academic awards, speaking engagements, presentations and publications. Really, these should be included selectively. There's no need to overload your resume with these. And a lot of times the awards that you may have gotten in high school, unless they're like quite distinguished, don't really measure up. So use these sparingly, but Like if you give a big presentation, or you get some very nice scholarship, or you apply for some grant, this is a great opportunity for that. Here's some examples of that. So these can be like competitions you entered that you won, or what have you. Okay, so some final tips. This is from Google, so that's why it's a passion for tech. But remember, just if you're going to take anything away from this presentation, just remember to include your graduation month and year on your resume. Explain your work using that formula. It really changed my resume, and it makes a huge difference, as you saw from that example. Highlight the experience, what you've done, the technical skills you've developed, and the professional experiences you've had, and then talk about your strengths, knowledge, and experience. Remember, this is kind of the way of advertising you as a potential candidate. So you want them to come away with a good impression, and you want them to see the whole you, not like a contrived version of you. Okay. Oh, some other resources that you can go to, careers.utah.edu are great examples. They have people who can look over your resume and edit it and give you advice and do mock interviews. So if you want to take the next step, you can do that. But any questions regarding this? Any specific questions about what you should and shouldn't include in a resume, how you can make yours better? I have some other stuff that we're going to go over, but there's usually a lot of questions. So feel free to unmute yourselves or send something in the chat if you're shy.
Do you have any tips to beef up a resume for someone who has like no accomplishments?
So a lot of times, it's hard to know without actually seeing it, but you have to kind of think about like unique ways that you can frame it. And something that motivated me was I was in a similar situation where I didn't have enough stuff to fill it out. Like I didn't have any really nice job experience. And so that was a big motivator for me to get involved in things, and start working on stuff on my own so that I could flesh those out. So a really good way to, like, it's easy to tell when someone's trying to just like fill in the gaps. Nice formatting can always help, which we'll kind of go over in a little bit. But really, if you're finding that on your resume you don't have a good way of filling it out, look over where you think your weaknesses, and then try to find opportunities or think of things that you could do that would give you experience there, or would give you something to fill that out. Professors are always looking for people to get involved in research. I'm pretty sure because if they use structure, anyone can email a professor and ask to get involved in some capacity, and most of them are pretty amicable, especially within our department, and I believe MECI is that way too. There's lots of like personal projects you can work on, and it can be really anything relates to it. But if you want some like specific advice, all of you are welcome to send me your resume and I can give detailed critiques of it. But yeah, any other questions?
I was wondering if you have any like programs, like kind of like Microsoft Word or something that you like to use when making a resume.
Yeah, that's going to be the next thing I talk about. So my last lecture was on this markdown language called LaTeX or LaTeX, which I have a nice little tutorial video on Sparks' channel. But for those who weren't there, LaTeX essentially just is an algorithm for calculating the best way to space things and make them look nice. And that ends up being quite well suited to making a resume because you're only limited to one page, so space matters, right? If you take up space to do one thing, that means you don't have that space to do another thing. So if you have like 5 bullet points under a work experience, there's a trade-off between what you can no longer add because you had those 5 bullet points. So, but I wanted to answer any last minute questions before I move on to that. I have a template that all of you can use to make your resume look really nice. And yeah, unfortunately, first impressions are everything. And so if your resume looks kind of nasty, It's not going to set a good precedent, or it's not going to make for a good impression of you. So it's important to have it look good, and that's what this template will help you do. Any other questions about general resume tips before we move on? Just feel free to interrupt me along the way if you have any, or think of any as well.
Just to start off, like I don't have much in like lab experience, so like I wouldn't be able to put that on a resume. But let's say that like I have been working at like the Home Depot as a supervisor. Would that be something to like put on if I'm like still trying to apply to like a science job, if that makes sense?
Yeah. For a while, I worked in fast food when I was in high school, and for a while before I had gained enough, I had that on my resume, and it was kind of embarrassing because you're applying for like, yeah, I want to apply for this engineering internship, and it's like, yeah, I was flipping burgers. I think the best approach there is to look for what relevant skills you can learn from that job that would be of interest to someone who's hiring an intern, right? Because people who are going to student job fairs or looking for students to do internships, they're not like, oh yeah, this person needs to have X number of years of experience. Like they have at least, if they're honest, they know that the people that they're applying for, this is probably their first time doing an engineering gig. But what they are looking for is whether you have necessary skills to make you successful in that position. So, I mean, working in fast food, I spent a lot of time working in the front of the house, so I had to deal with a lot of customers and ensure I was able to communicate with them effectively and work within a team to make sure that orders were placed to the back of the house effectively, and you know, be amicable. And so I would kind of frame it, those jobs that aren't necessarily technical, in a way that shows that you're developing useful either like team skills, communication skills, problem solving. That's a good way to emphasize things that really are applicable in any situation. And that can be a good way to take things that you've done that you might not think are impactful and make them impactful. Does that help?
Yeah, that helped a ton. Thank you.
Any others? Okay, well, feel free to interrupt me. So this template was also kind of stolen from that triangle engineering fraternity, but I assume all of you can see this. But if you look over here, it looks quite nice. Everything's got nice spacing. It looks very professional. It's really clean. There's links to everything, so people can click on stuff and see how and go to more dynamic content. So this is a good way to emphasize some other stuff, right? We're in a world where a lot of stuff is handled digitally, which can be somewhat frustrating, but also it opens up a lot of opportunities, because now you can sort of extend your resume by linking it to other things, right? So let's say you did some project that's available on the web, or there's like a news article, or there's some other way of accessing it. You can put links in your resume so that some recruiter can click on them and actually go to that and see what you've done. Which ends up being really nice because then they can get a better idea of what you've done, and it allows you to save some space, right? Rather than having to describe in painful detail what this project you did is, you can give like a pretty general thing, save some space, and if they're really interested in learning more, then they can click on it. The other things it lets you do is link to some other profiles you might have. So you can put your LinkedIn on there. If you're a coding person, you can put your GitHub on there, you can put your email on there, or your website, which is another way that they can learn even more information, right? I mentioned that as you gain more experience, you'll eventually run out of room on your resume and you have to start being selective. But that doesn't mean you need to completely, oh my gosh, an Amber Alert. How do I stop this? Okay. you don't need to completely ignore those, right? If someone's so inclined, they could click on your LinkedIn and see all of your experience, um, which can help flesh you out. So it kind of allows you to go beyond that, which is really nice. So I'm going to make this specific template available, but I recommend doing some modifications depending on the job that you're applying for. So this is a pretty general one that follows the presentation that I gave, the one that was stolen from Google. But I'll also show you mine, which is a little bit different. And I'll talk about why I included some of these aspects and why I didn't include others. Okay, so this is what mine looks like. So it's a little formatted a little bit differently. And the first thing that's really different is that I have a summary up here. So people go back and forth of whether you should include a summary. And the rule that I think you should follow is if you're doing a sit-down interview with someone, not like a recruiting fair thing, you should include a summary because it gives them, it's more keywords and things for them to pick up on. And it also gives like a brief introduction to you. However, if you're at a job fair, you should not include a summary. People don't have time to read that and they're not. So this is just wasted space. The next thing is down here. Some people will say you shouldn't include personal interests, but it can also help you flesh you out as being a more interesting person who's well-rounded and provide some conversation topics in the interview, which can sometimes make it a lot more comfortable for you and for others. A strategy that a lot of professionals in this field will employ is they'll start out by asking some sort of personal question that is more about things that you're interested in to kind of lighten and bring some levity to the situation because our interviews are stressful. And so if you have some stuff on there, it gives them an easy thing to ask you about. And then they can, they'll have something to ask you about and it's something you're passionate about, it's something you're interested in, you'll have a lot to say. And it can make it a little easier to work into the rest of the interview, make it a little less stressful. But yeah, depending on what specific interview you're applying for, I would have changed things. So I mean, more and more, certain parts of this are less relevant as you get further into your career, and so sometimes it is worth it to just drop things in order to save space and put that space into adding other stuff. Okay, any questions about these templates, how to use this or anything like that?
You said that you had a video posted on like this whole latex thing or whatever it's called.
Yeah, it's on Spark's channel.
On his YouTube channel, right?
Mm-hmm. It's called like an introduction to LaTeX or latex
Gotcha.
is how it's spelled. It won't go over, like this is a little more complicated than what I went over. But the nice thing about this one is in the like coding section here, it has these commented sections that essentially walk you through everything. So all you need to do is just edit sections like these, and it will automatically generate this nice document with what you've added. And if you ever have any questions, you can ask me for help. What you might run into is there's two documents in here in this project. There's resume.text and resume.cls. The .cls is like a class file. It's just a bunch of code stuff that's unrelated to the rest of the resume. So you don't need to worry about that. But this makes it really easy to just fill in all of this stuff and then it will generate this. Let's see, any other questions? Okay, I'll just move on to the next thing. So I told you that a lot of these big companies now filter you by your resume. They'll just look for keywords with a sort of an algorithm. And if your resume doesn't meet that, then you're basically just not going to even get considered. No, not a real person's probably not even going to look at your resume. So you want to get past that. And so Jobscan is a great website. There's other ones I think you can find, but this is the one that I've used. And you can essentially upload your resume and upload the job description, or upload kind of some keywords or what you think the job description would be like, and it will give you like a percent match and recommend some improvements of where you could improve your resume to try to match that job description that you're applying for. So how this would work is, let's say you're on Indeed.com, which is a place that a lot of people apply for jobs, or you're on Handshake, which is the used one. Sometimes they'll post like a job description. So you just copy and paste that into here, copy and paste your resume into here, and that would give you sort of a percent match and give you some recommendations for how you could make your resume more optimized for that specific job app, which I think is super useful. My recommendation, if you're like just getting started, is to apply for as many things as possible. That way, if you land a bunch of them, that means you have options. If you just land one of them, then at least you got something. And that's a good way to start building experience. And with things like this and having a really nice resume, you really up your chances. The biggest thing is just to get someone to like take a second look or want to keep looking at your resume. And bad formatting or bad wording and very abstract explanations of your skill sets is just an easy way for someone to ignore it. So I highly recommend using this template or modifying it a little bit to make your resume look nicer, using those tools that I discussed in the presentation for how to actually word some of these things, and throwing it into here to make sure it matches. So that's pretty much everything that I wanted to cover. Like I said, if any of you want me to look over your resume, I'm happy to do that. I'll recommend some ways that you can improve your wording. I'll recommend changes in formatting. But the specific assignment for students in the lab class is to use this template and essentially put your resume in this format, and we'll have a turn-in option on Canvas for that. And then we'll have you critique each other's resumes as well. But if you want me to do a personal critique before that, I'm happy to do that. If you're not in the class, if you're not in the lab section, then you don't have to worry about that, but I'll still help you on your resume if you want. So yeah, any last minute questions here? We have apparently 5 minutes until this meeting ends. So
for the lab assignment, will we also have to do it in LaTeX as well?
yes.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, this template makes it pretty easy because you can look over here and see, okay, this text is here, this text is here, and then just fill it in that way. And if you run into trouble, don't worry, I'm happy to help. The first LaTeX video I did was kind of just like an introduction of how you could use it simply, but this is more of the meat of how you'd use it to really make a very fancy looking document. Oh yeah, one more method I wanted to discuss. A lot of times people have a nice resume and then they won't know how to actually present it in the interview. And that ends up being a big problem. Sparks was talking to me about an interview he did where it was very difficult for them to articulate what their experience was. So a good sort of general rule you can follow is called the STAR method. It stands for situation, task, action, result. So if a person is asking you about some internship you did, you can present it that way. And it's a very good way to tick all the boxes of what they're looking for, and a good way for you to organize your own thoughts. Because the last thing you want to do is just start rambling kind of aimlessly, like walking in some random direction with how you're explaining it, because that's just not effective. So in the situation, you want to sort of present the situation, the context as you found it, what the challenging situation entailed. Next, the task is what were you required to achieve. You want to be specific and highlight some intrinsic motivations as well if they're there. Like, oh, I really wanted to learn this to better understand it so I could apply it to my field. Or I was told that we need to meet these objectives and I thought we could do even better. Even if you're just saying I was told to meet these objectives, that's fine. The next is the action. So what did you do and why did you do it? Essentially, like, okay, given this task, we did this and we did it for this reason. And the next, the R, is result. So what was the outcome of these actions? And a lot of people like to add a second R, so star, where the last R is a reflection on the experience. So, what did you learn from this? And so that's a really good method for how to actually present things in your resume when a recruiter asks you about them. And it's worthwhile before you even go into a career fair or into an interview to practice the STAR method with all of your things on your resume that are relevant, of course, like work experience, not education so much. That way, if someone asks you about it, you'll have already practiced it. It'll be nice and smooth, and it'll sound really nice and clean. Okay, we got 2 minutes left. Any last questions? Great. Well, thank you all for attending. I hope this was helpful. When I went through these presentations, they were very helpful, and I learned a lot, and it's made my resume look a lot better. And so I hope to do the same for you. So don't be afraid to reach out if you need any help, and have a good rest of your day. I'll make sure all these resources are available to you, and they'll be recording on Spark's YouTube channel if you forget anything. Alrighty. With that, we'll end it.